Some teachers are really great, and I think Professor Janssen made that apparent. They just get their students, they can motivate them, inspire them, help them to overcome insurmountable challenges, and get them to do far more than you'd ever expect. Not all of us have that gift. There are movies made about such great teachers. If you remember Robin Williams in Dead Poets Society, just amazing. But not all of us are like that. We don't all have that natural gift. Some of us might be a bit lacking in reading the room or reading the people around us, but there is still hope, because we would all like to be the teacher who has that kind of impact. We would all like to have, as parents, we would like to have our children taught by teachers who have that kind of impact. But there is hope. The neurosequential model in education, I believe, is able to give that when lots of other classroom strategies may be a bit lacking. So I'd like to tell you about childhood trauma, a little bit about adverse childhood experiences, and how I believe the neurosequential model in education can help us make a bit of progress. I attended this conference, and it promised classroom strategies that were trauma-informed and classroom management that would help. And I was a bit skeptical. I'm a science teacher. We don't really talk about emotions in class. I don't have a juicy set workbook to kind of rely on. And so I wasn't too sure how I was going to be able to help children with trauma in my classroom. But I was actually really pleasantly surprised, because the neurosequential model in education helped me realize why some of the strategies that I've developed over lots of time of teaching had really worked well, and why some were disastrous. So playing music to my students when I wanted them to work through science exercises really helped their productivity, as did getting them to stand up, stretch, breathe, and do some ninja star jumps when they were lethargic. Telling them that it was in the exam or trying to scare them into working wasn't nearly as effective. So I want to explain trauma and how that has an impact on learning. There you go. So trauma is used a lot, but it's often quite difficult to define. And so I'm relying on the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration definition. So it works on the event, the experience, and the effect. So a traumatic event would be something that was experienced and had a negative effect long after the event had passed. So when my daughters and I were hijacked at gunpoint, the event was exactly the same for all of us, but the experience and the effect was very different. My youngest daughter, who has just recently graduated with a master's in architecture, doesn't have a driver's license. So I want to tell you about the seminal study on adverse childhood experiences. So, published in 1998 by Felitti and Under et al., they asked some questions. So the questions ranged from, were children exposed to physical abuse, psychological abuse, sexual abuse? Was their mother or stepmother treated violently? Were they exposed to criminal behavior, substance abuse, or mental illness? And the title of the paper is, and it was really quite groundbreaking stuff, and there's been a lot of stuff since then, but essentially the effect that childhood abuse and household dysfunction has on the causes of death in adults, the adverse childhood experiences. So I'm going to be calling those ACEs, because that adverse childhood experiences is a bit of a mouthful. Later studies by many other researchers included the chronic illness or death of a caregiver, so you can think our AIDS pandemic, unemployment, and community violence. The Centers for Disease Control and Prevention website has many interesting statistics and resources. And many researchers have gone on to show the effect of both physiological and mental health effects throughout the lifespan. In South Africa, we've had our own longitudinal study on ACEs that started in 1990, and in fact it was initially called the Birth to 10, then the Birth to 20, now it's the Birth to 30 study, and it started in 1990 and conducted in Soweto. And in fact, if you go to this website, there's a huge amount of really interesting information that they've collected over this long period of time. But they show the effect of ACEs in the South African context. And Manyema and Richter showed that 88% of this particular cohort would have experienced at least one ACE, and 35% would have experienced 4 ACEs or more. And that really has an effect on how you're going to study and learn and show up in class. Bethel et al. In an American study showed that children who had 2 or more ACEs were 2.67 times more likely to repeat a grade at school. And so these ACEs don't only have an effect on the illnesses that you're likely to collect over time, but also how you can show up in a classroom. So back to my neurosequential model in education. So the neurosequential model in education, so as the term implies, neuroscience and basically sequencing. So based on the work by Dr. Bruce Perry, it gives us a simplified model of the brain, and all of the input that comes from inside our bodies based on whether we feel hungry or tired or discomfort is processed first in the brainstem, then in the diencephalon, then the limbic area, and then finally the cortex. And all the information that we perceive from outside with our senses goes through the same set of sequencing. And how we are able to understand things really depends on the state that we are in. So a child who has suffered from a fair number of ACEs is more likely to be dysregulated and unable to access their cortex. And they're more likely to be in a state of fear or alarm. And so they are not showing up in class with the same level of focus that children without ACEs. And often this is then misinterpreted and misdiagnosed as attention deficit disorder. So how can the neurosequential model help us to reduce the effects? And it's all about first regulate, then relate, then reason. So to regulate, you need to be in a calm state. I have to say that I am the physical embodiment of this theory because my cortex left a while ago, but we're working on that. So you need to be regulated. You need to be calm. You need to feel balanced to be able to actually access your cortex. And you need to be able to relate to the people around you, and only then can you actually start reasoning. And reasoning is obviously where all of the intelligent stuff happens. So when you come across somebody who is having a little bit of a meltdown, standing in front of a whole lot of people with cameras, and sort of like losing a little bit, that's not the time for advice or for a lecture. So now we get to my cute mug. So I bought this for my daughter years ago, long before I'd even heard of Dr. Bruce Perry's work. But essentially, you can't tell somebody to be calm. If they're not feeling calm, telling them isn't necessarily going to help them. And really what happened to you is a far more important question than what is wrong with you. Because very often if you've got a child who is unable to control their emotions and is having a bit of a wobble, often they will be the people who will act out in class or zone out in class. And it's not about what's wrong with them, which is often the question that the child themselves or parents or teachers will be asking. It's really got to do with what happened to them and what is causing them not to be able to engage. And so that added stress is what's stopping them from getting on with it. So in general, for learning and growth, a little stress is necessary, and Dr. Perry emphasizes the fact that that stress needs to be predictable and moderate and controllable. So load shedding, as Delisha was talking about earlier, when we've got a schedule and we're sticking to the schedule, it's predictable, we know when it's going to end, we can plan around it, and it's a tolerable amount of stress. However, when suddenly it's not on the schedule and it's gone out for hours and there's no communication about when it's likely to come back, we feel a little bit dysregulated and overwhelmed by that. And when children have suffered from trauma and a number of ACEs, often it's because they have been exposed to unpredictable stress for a long period of time that was extreme. And so they're in a sensitized state. Instead of being able to build resilience, they are sensitized to stress. So when something stressful happens in the classroom, they immediately go up and are unable to then regulate their emotions as well as they should. So what practical things can we put in place to help people regulate themselves? So the most important thing is that you have to be regulated as an adult when dealing with children. A dysregulated adult can dysregulate an entire classroom of children. But if you are regulated, you can help calm dysregulated people around you. And a really powerful way of regulating is through rhythm. So our first experience of rhythm comes from hearing our mother's heartbeat in the womb. And so rhythmic activities like walking, swinging, jumping, bouncing a ball, jumping on a trampoline are all ways that we can use to regulate ourselves. And in terms of relating to people, the good news is that it's invariably not about you. So you don't have to react, and you don't have to take it personally. But you can try and co-regulate that person, and you can minimize it by minimizing the power differential. You can sit down instead of standing above a child. You can move from behind your desk to the person in front of you. You can also put in a time frame so that when you have a meeting, you've got an agenda, you've got a time frame. It's predictable. You feel as if you're in control. At school, you can have a clear assessment schedule, so there aren't tests that pop up and scare you at the last minute. You can have a regular bedtime routine at home, which also helps children to feel that the world is predictable and safe. But back to our regulate, relate, reason. So when somebody is having a bit of a meltdown, how do you then help them to calm back down again? And so once again, you want to be able to help them not to feel dysregulated, and you want to be able to follow that regulate, relate, reason with all of the people that you come into contact with. So if you're looking for more information, now I know this is funny, like I'm quite entertained. I am promoting Ms. Winfrey's book. She is the promoter of books, but in fact this book is so important to me and has been so life-changing that I feel compelled to tell absolutely everybody about it. And there's another book by Dr. Bruce Perry that I would strongly recommend from Nicci's book club, called The Boy Who Was Raised as a Dog and Other Stories from a Child Psychiatrist's Notebook by Bruce Perry and Maya Salovitz. And there's lots of additional information on his website. So the neurosequential model, if you take nothing else away, the core idea is that to be able to reach the cortex, we need to regulate, then relate, then reason. Because in fact, if we are not reaching the cortex, where the thinking, abstract thinking, maths, language, all of that actually happens, we're not actually teaching. Because education is all about changing the brain. And the last thing I want to leave you with is that adverse childhood experiences and trauma can be passed from one generation to another. so that for every child where we can reduce those effects, we can literally change the history of that family for generations to come. Thank you.